Collisions in Unity. This is an extreme explaining tutorial. Here we have 4 game objects, 1 dynamic, 2 kinematic and 1 static. A dynamic object is controlled by the physics engine, but can be influenced by us programmers by applying forces and changing the velocity. Kinematic objects are not controlled by the physics engine. Instead, we programmers control their movement by changing their velocity or changing their positions in the update events. A static object should not be moved at all. If you need to move a static object, then consider turning it into a kinematic object. I should point out that all these objects have a collider component. If you have some game object without a collider component, then that object will never be a part of this discussion. You can move it as you want by changing its position. That is irrelevant because game objects without a collider component can never participate in a collision. What happens if we apply gravity on our dynamic object? Let's check.
Call.
As you can see, a collision event was generated. What happens if we check is trigger flag on our kinematic object?
Trig. Call.
As you can see, if the isTrigger flag is set, then no collision event will be generated. Instead, a trigger event will be generated. What happens if we set the isTrigger flag on the dynamic object? Let's check.
Trig. Trig. Trig.
So, as soon as at least one of the objects has isTrig flag set, then no collision events will be generated, only trig events. What happens if we move the kinematic 1 object up?
Call.
Then a collision event happens. What happens if we move the kinematic 1 object down? As you can see, nothing happens. No collision events. That is because, by default, at least one of the objects needs to be a dynamic in order for a collision event to be generated. But what if we want collision events even among non-dynamic objects? Then we can set the Use Full Kinematic Contacts flag. Let's check what happens now when we move down.
Call. Call.
So we get collision events even among non-dynamic objects. So by using this flag we can get collision events on all objects that collide with the kinematic object. As you have seen before, our dynamic object will collide with the kinematic object if we put the gravity on. But let's now go to the collision matrix up here, which controls the collision layers, and uncheck the box between dynamic and kinematic objects. Let's also set the isTrigger flag on kinematic 2 object. Now apply gravity.
Call.
No events were generated. So by unchecking checkboxes in the collision matrix, you can completely prevent collision and trigger events from ever happening. Okay, let's now go to some slides and summarize. Here is what happens when two collider objects collide. First, Unity checks the collision matrix to see if collision is allowed or not. If the collision is not allowed, then it will stop, without generating any collision or trigger events. But if the collision is allowed, then it looks if at least one of the collider object has trigger flag set. If yes, then it will generate on-trigger event, and then it will stop. If no object has is trigger on, then it will look if at least one of the object is a dynamic object. If yes, then it will generate on-collision event, and then it will stop. If no object is dynamic, then it will look if at least one object has the flag Use Full Kinematic Contacts set. If yes, then it will generate on-collision event, and then it will stop. If no, then it will stop without generating any collision or trigger events. Let's now look at some well-known games and discuss how we would configure our collider objects. Let's begin with Alien Invaders. Shields do not move, so we should make them static. Also, we need to sense when a bullet hits a shield, so we should set its is-trigger flag. Everything else moves, the bullets, the ships and the aliens. So we should make them kinematic and set their is-trigger flags. Observe that we prefer trigger events instead of collision events, because they are more lightweight. Here we have the Flappy Bird game. The bird is affected by gravity, so it must be a dynamic object. The ground does not move, so we should make it static. The columns move and are not affected by gravity, so we should make them kinematic. We need to sense when the bird hits the column or the floor, so we can stop the game. An overlap check is all that is needed, so we set the is-trigger flag of the bird. The last game is the Pong game. We have a ball, two pedals, a ceiling and the floor, and two walls. The simplest implementation is to make the ball a kinematic object with is-trigger flag set. Pedals move, so we should make them kinematic. Ceiling, floor and the walls do not move, so we should make them static. It is not always easy to choose the right type of collider object, and occasionally more than one alternative is possible. So sometimes you have to experiment to get it right. That's all for this tutorial. Thank you for watching.